Christopher Hitchens is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and the author most recently of God is Not Great, and he joins us from our bureau in New York City. Thanks very much for coming in.
Very nice of you to have me.
And you write that the argument between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and by extension the argument between right and left in America ever since, is actually an argument about Tom Paine.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think both Adams and Jefferson acknowledged it in their different ways. Adams certainly thought of Paine as a very dangerous person. Well, remember, at the time Adams was writing, the word democratical, which is the word most generally used, or democratic, was meant as a term of insult. Someone who thought like that was someone who was in favor of mob rule. Probably the word democracy doesn't get used in a non-pejorative way until Paine begins to write. So that's the context one needs for recalling that.
Well, the mob rule that they were alluding to was, of course, at least in part, the mob that fed the hemlock to Socrates.
Yes, you could say that. And Paine, of course, agreed with Edmund Burke, who was the great people call it Burke a Tory. They're slightly wrong in saying that. Burke was a classical liberal, but Paine agreed with him that the rule of what would have been called ochlocracy, that's literally to say mob rule, the rule of the crowd, was a wicked thing. He, like Burke, he was very worried by the anti-Catholic Gordon riots in London, and he didn't like what he saw, which he saw more than Burke did, of the rule of sheer street force in Paris either. In fact, he was twice very near to lose his life to it.
Yes.
But he thought that the educated common man, the man of no property necessarily, but of some literacy and education, that could change humanity and change civilization, change history for the better.
And which you remind us that indeed there were great arguments during the American Revolution between those, including Thomas Paine, who thought the revolution ought to be a little bit more revolutionary.
Well, yes, and in particular on the question of slavery. I mean, Paine wanted, and twice tried to get the United States to begin itself with, or second case, to begin again without what some people think of its original sin, as its original sin. I mean, he wanted slavery struck out by the Declaration. Jefferson wrote a denunciation of slavery for the Declaration, which was amended and taken out, probably, but not entirely because of the objections of Georgia and the Carolinas. Also some New York forces who, if they weren't actually holding slaves, were doing a lot of transporting of them. And then the second time that Paine took a great stand on this was against Jefferson after the Louisiana Purchase, which he had actually suggested to Jefferson. Jefferson may have come by the idea himself, but it was originally Paine's idea that we should take advantage of the difficulties of Bonaparte, buy what they had to offer, which was doubling the size of the United States, and not allow any more slavery in the new territories. Start again. And again was overruled. Jefferson was in such a hurry to get the sugar crop in that he allowed slaves to be unloaded at New Orleans, and Paine was terribly disappointed at that time too.
Yes. And in a way, the rights of man is another argument between Thomas Paine and, Edmund Burke, a great figure, as somebody who was a supporter of the American Revolution, but who, both writing in the very early days of the French Revolution, this was an argument between them about what might ensue from the French Revolution.
Yes, and in a way they're both right. I mean, Burke was, as you say, a great defender of the American Revolution. Actually, he was the editor of Jefferson's last appeal to King George, vindication of the rights of North America. But the last thing they tried before saying, okay, Paine is right, we're going to have to leave the empire altogether. He was a great defender of the rights of the people of India against the depredations of British imperialists like Warren Hastings. And I think Conor Cruise O'Brien, in his study of Burke, is right in saying that he was trying by indirection to plead for his native Ireland as well, and to try and secure independence for Ireland somewhat by stealth, by pleading in this way, which meant that he had to oppose the French Revolution, because Jacobinism was just going to mobilize all the forces of reaction in Britain, and there'd be no more talk of reform. And he also foresaw the likelihood that Jacobinism would lead to a military dictatorship, the dictatorship of just one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. And when you read his paragraphs on that, you have to say, well, these are very prescient.
Yes.
However, Paine's riposte, which was that you don't understand that this is not just the slaughter of the guillotine of one monarch. By the way, Paine was opposed to the execution of King Louis. and is opposed to capital punishment in general. But he said this is undoing the work of centuries. It's destroying not a man but a system of monarchy, and this is a thing that absolutely has to be done. He was also hoping, of course, that another republic would come on the scene, a major European one that would end the isolation of America.
And indeed, that the seeds of the revolutions that he had seen in America and in France, seeds that he played no small part in planting himself, would find fertile ground in England, which, of course, was set off by the radicalism of the French Revolution and the English response to it.
Yes, well, I mean, you have to wait many years, but by the time the movement for universal suffrage in England finally gets underway, long after Paine's dead, in the mid-19th century, it is often inspired by his writing. There was a long delay in the seminal effect of it, but the Chartist movement, for example, owed a great deal to him, as did various movements in Ireland, which, when were in their infancy, he had also supported. But the irony was one I think you alluded to a little earlier. Paine wanted the American Revolution to be much more radical and deep-going and far-going, and he wanted the French Revolution to be somewhat more restrained, not to become too utopian, too fanatical, or too totalitarian. And I think it's actually the sign of a very brave and principled revolutionary that he was willing in both cases to quarrel with his friends on these matters.
We're talking with Christopher Hitchens about his new book, Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, part of the series on books that change the world. If you'd like to join our conversation, 800-989-8255. Email is talk@npr.org. Let's talk with Chris. Chris with us on the line from Tallahassee in Florida.
Thank you very much for letting me ask a question,
Sure.
Mr. Hitchens. And I know you touched on it slightly, but by our standards, it may be hard to judge, but what I wanted to ask you, by their standards, was Thomas Paine considered a difficult and obstreperous person, maybe a difficult person to get along with, and could that have affected his place in history?
Yes, he was thought of as a rather farouche character, if you'll allow the expression, a rather spiky guy. No one ever remembers him saying anything mean or cruel or nasty. And in his personal dealings, he seems to have been very honest and very fair, but he could be quite rude in print. He was a very stern polemicist. And he had a beverage problem. He was a boozer. And sometimes that seems to have made him untidy and perhaps even a little malodorous. The problem got worse as he got older. And he had a piety problem as well. He didn't really believe that religion was good for people. In fact, he thought that, on balance, it was more harmful than an inculcator of morals or ethics. He wasn't an atheist, as he's often been accused of being. He was actually rather a respectful deist. He thought there probably was an author of creation. But he didn't think religion could help you to understand that.
Indeed, he was writing parts of the Rights of Man and referring frequently to the Bible, which you suggest he was doing from memory.
Yes, he knew the Bible more or less by heart, and he was able to write his counterpart book, The Age of Reason. Counterpart, I mean, to Rights of Man, when in jail in Paris and under sentence of death from a sort of quasi-agnostic regime, full of ironies. He wrote that the Bible was complete nonsense, man-made, plagiarized from earlier Jewish books, and later exploited by Muslims to plagiarize another holy book from those predecessors. He was a very good textual critic. No one had ever said in public, these books are man-made, they're not the word of God at all. But he was writing, I have to say, as an atheist myself, he was writing to defend God against those who believed in him. He was writing to vindicate God's reputation against the believers.
I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Did this persona serve to give him maybe a lesser place in history than he might have originally had?
Well, it certainly gave his enemies all kinds of excuses, and his last few years, when he finally came back to the United States, having been broken in health by imprisonment in France and exile, and having been disowned by George Washington and Gouverneur Morris and various other of his old friends, and living in very reduced circumstances on a slight pension from Congress. Yes, and being an atheist, which was rather being accused of being an atheist.
Yet we've managed
taking refuge in the brandy bottle. Yeah, his last years were pretty squalid, and when he first went to vote in an election, he was turned away. He was in upstate New York, not allowed to vote until he couldn't register. He wasn't an American citizen. This was the guy who had the idea of the American Revolution, and almost certainly was the first one to use the words United States of America.